In the early morning hours of September 7th, 1939, a Polish captain stood at the entrance of a concrete bunker, watching the horizon where German tanks rolled like a dark tide across the countryside. Captain Władysław Raginis had just received orders that would seal his fate. He was to hold a fortified line at Wizna with 700 men against an advancing force of 42,000 German soldiers. The odds were impossible, the outcome certain, yet what happened next would transform this forgotten corner of Poland into legend. This is the story of a man who made a sacred vow and kept it unto death, earning his place among history's greatest military heroes. To understand the magnitude of Captain Raginis' sacrifice, we must first journey back to the world that shaped him. Born on June 27, 1908, in the village of Zaryni near Daugavpils, in what is now Latvia, Raginis grew up in a landowning family, steeped in patriotic tradition. His childhood was marked by the tumultuous aftermath of World War I and the rebirth of Poland as an independent nation. After 123 years of partition and foreign rule, Poland had finally emerged from the ashes of empire, and young Władysław breathed this air of newfound freedom from his earliest days. The path to military service seemed inevitable for a young man of his background and convictions. In 1927, fresh from gymnasium, he enrolled at the Infantry Non-Commissioned Officer School in Komorowo, near Ostro-Mazowiecka. His instructors would later describe him as a mediocre student, unremarkable in his academic performance. Yet within this seemingly ordinary young man burned something that textbooks could not measure, a depth of character that would only reveal itself under the most extreme circumstances. After completing his studies in 1928, he quickly advanced to the Infantry Officers School in the same town, graduating on July 15, 1930. His early military career unfolded with the steady rhythm of peacetime service. Assigned to the 76th Infantry Regiment stationed in Grodno, he served as a platoon commander and instructor at the School Cadet Corps. These were years of routine drills, training exercises, and the gradual accumulation of the skills that would serve him in his final hour. His superiors noted his competence and leadership qualities, traits that would eventually place him at the center of one of the war's most dramatic defensive stands. By 1939, he had earned promotion to captain and assignment to the elite Border Defense Corps, commanding the 3rd Company Heavy Machine Gun Battalion of the Border Defense Corps Regiment Sarny, under Lieutenant Colonel Nikodem Sulik. As summer turned to autumn in 1939, the political situation in Europe had reached a breaking point. Adolf Hitler's Germany had been making increasingly aggressive moves, demanding territory and threatening war. Poland, reborn barely 20 years earlier, found itself directly in the crosshairs of Nazi ambition. The country that had fought so hard to regain independence now faced the prospect of losing it again to a force more terrible than any it had previously encountered. The German war machine had been preparing for this moment, assembling the most modern and powerful military force the world had ever seen. On September 1, 1939, the storm finally broke. German forces launched their attack at dawn, unleashing more than 2,000 tanks supported by nearly 900 bombers and over 400 fighter planes. 60 divisions and nearly 1.5 million men poured across Poland's borders from East Prussia and Germany in the north, and Silesia and Slovakia in the south. The Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, destroyed most of Poland's modest fleet of 300 planes within the first few days. The disparity was staggering, overwhelming, yet across the country, Polish soldiers prepared to fight against impossible odds. Captain Raginis received his fateful assignment on September 2nd. The Border Defense Corps Regiment Sarny had been split, with most units sent to Upper Silesia to man the fortified area Silesia. Raginis and his men, however, were ordered to Osowiec fortress near the border with East Prussia. It was here that he learned of his new command, the Wizna fortified area, a defensive line that would become his final battlefield. The Wizna position was both strategically crucial and woefully incomplete. Before the war, Polish military planners had recognized the importance of this area, which guarded the crossings of the Narew and Biebza rivers and was designed to shield Polish positions further south. The defensive line stretched 9 kilometers between the villages of Kołodzieje and Grądy Woniecko, with Wizna at its center. Yet when war broke out, The fortifications were far from finished. What should have been a comprehensive defensive system was instead a collection of bunkers and strongpoints, many lacking proper equipment and supplies. Raginis chose his command post carefully, selecting bunker Guderian 126 near the village of Góra Strękowa. The bunker sat on a hill at the exact center of the Polish lines, giving him the best possible view of the battlefield and communication with his scattered forces. His command consisted of approximately 700 soldiers and non-commissioned officers and 20 officers. Their arsenal included 6 pieces of 75mm artillery, 24 heavy machine guns, 18 machine guns, and 2 anti-tank rifles with just 20 rounds between them. It was a force that might have seemed adequate for a training exercise, but which now faced the prospect of holding back the German war machine. The men under Raginis's command came from various units, thrown together by the chaos of mobilization and the desperate need to defend every possible position. They were farmers and factory workers, teachers and shopkeepers, united by their Polish blood and their determination to defend their homeland. Many had never seen combat before. Others were veterans of the Polish-Soviet War or the various border conflicts of the interwar period. What they all shared was the knowledge that they were about to face the most powerful military force in Europe with little more than their rifles, their courage, and their captain's leadership. As his men dug in and prepared their positions, Raginis must have contemplated the magnitude of what lay ahead. Military intelligence reports painted a grim picture of German strength and capabilities. The Wehrmacht had already demonstrated its devastating effectiveness in the opening days of the campaign, smashing through Polish defenses with a combination of tanks, aircraft, and infantry that the world had never seen before. This was not the static warfare of the previous World War, but something new and terrifying, a form of combat that the Germans called Blitzkrieg, lightning war. Yet, even as reports arrived of Polish defeats elsewhere, even as the sound of German artillery grew closer each day, Raginis and his men continued their preparations. They reinforced their bunkers, laid out fields of fire for their machine guns, and established communication lines between positions. The captain moved among his troops, checking their readiness, offering encouragement, and demonstrating the calm leadership that would sustain them in the dark hours to come. He knew, as they all knew, that help would not arrive in time. The main Polish armies were fighting for their lives elsewhere, and the strategic reserve was already committed to defending Warsaw. On the horizon, dust clouds marked the approach of the German advance guard. Soon those clouds would resolve into tanks and trucks, artillery pieces and marching columns of infantry. At their head rode General Heinz Guderian, one of Germany's most capable commanders and the architect of modern armored warfare. His 19th Panzer Corps was spearheading the German drive toward Brest, and the small Polish force at Wizna stood directly in his path. The stage was set for a confrontation that would echo through history. 700 Polish soldiers against 42,000 Germans. Incomplete fortifications against the most modern military equipment. A captain who had sworn an oath against a general who had never known defeat. The morning of September 7th brought with it an eerie stillness that seemed to press against the earth itself. Captain Raginis stood in the observation post of bunker Guderian 126. His field glasses trained on the northern horizon, where the first German reconnaissance units had been spotted at dawn. Behind him, his radio operator maintained contact with the scattered Polish positions, their voices crackling through static as they reported enemy movements. The captain's weathered hands gripped the concrete sill as he watched the distant glint of metal moving through the morning haze. This was it, the moment every soldier dreads and prepares for throughout his entire career. The German force approaching Wizna was unlike anything the Polish defenders had ever faced. General Heinz Guderian's 19th Panzer Corps represented the cutting edge of military evolution, a mechanized juggernaut that had already carved through Polish defenses elsewhere with terrifying efficiency. Over 350 tanks rolled forward in disciplined formations, their engines creating a rumble that could be felt through the ground. Behind them came artillery pieces, anti-tank guns, mortars, and thousands upon thousands of infantry. The numbers were staggering. 1,200 officers and 41,000 soldiers and non-commissioned officers, supported by 108 howitzers, 58 pieces of artillery, and hundreds of machine guns. Guderian himself was a legend in the making. Though the Poles facing him that morning knew little of his reputation, he had helped develop the very concept of blitzkrieg, the lightning war that combined tanks, aircraft, and motorized infantry into a devastating hammer blow that could shatter enemy lines in hours rather than weeks. His tactics emphasized speed, surprise, and the concentration of overwhelming force at critical points. He had studied the failures of the previous war, where massive armies had ground each other to pieces in static trenches and had helped create something entirely new. Now he brought that expertise to bear against a handful of Polish bunkers defending a river crossing. Yet for all his tactical brilliance, Guderian faced a challenge that his textbooks had not prepared him for. The Polish position at Wizna was not just another obstacle to be bypassed or overwhelmed. It was a fortress in the truest sense, manned by soldiers who had already made their choice. As German reconnaissance units probed the Polish lines, they met with sharp, accurate fire that sent them scrambling back to cover. The Poles were not running, they were not surrendering, they were preparing to fight. Captain Raginis understood the strategic picture with crystal clarity. His small force could not possibly defeat Guderian's corps in open battle, but they could do something perhaps more valuable. They could buy time. Every hour, every day that the Germans spent trying to reduce the Wizna position was time that allowed other Polish units to reposition, allowed the government to evacuate, allowed the remnants of the Polish army to organize new defensive lines further south. The mathematics of sacrifice had never been starker or more necessary. As the German forces deployed for their assault, Raginis made his rounds of the defensive positions. He moved from bunker to bunker, speaking quietly with his men, checking their ammunition supplies, ensuring that communication lines remained intact. His calm presence had an almost electric effect on the troops. Here was their captain, moving among them as if this were just another training exercise, his voice steady and reassuring. If he could remain composed in the face of such overwhelming odds, then perhaps they could as well. The first German probes came before noon. Motorcycle reconnaissance units raced along the roads, trying to identify weak points in the Polish line. They were met by precise bursts of machine gun fire that sent them racing back to safety. Then came the infantry, advancing in small groups under cover of mortar fire. The Polish positions erupted in response, muzzle flashes winking from concrete embrasures as the defenders engaged targets at maximum range. The sound of battle rolled across the countryside like thunder. By afternoon, Guderian had committed more substantial forces to the attack. Artillery shells began falling among the Polish positions, their explosions sending up geysers of earth and concrete fragments. The bunkers shook under the bombardment, dust cascading from their ceilings as the men inside gripped their weapons and waited for the barrage to lift. When it did, German infantry surged forward in coordinated waves, only to meet the withering fire of Polish machine guns and rifles. Bodies began to litter the approaches to the defensive line. The pattern continued through the day. German artillery would pound the Polish positions, then infantry would advance, only to be driven back by the surviving defenders. Tanks attempted to support the attacks, but the marshy ground and narrow approaches limited their effectiveness. The Poles had chosen their ground well, turning the terrain itself into an ally. As evening approached, the first day's fighting had cost the Germans hundreds of casualties, while barely denting the Polish defense. That night, as his men tended their wounds and redistributed ammunition, Captain Raginis gathered his officers around him in the command bunker. The air was thick with cordite smoke and the smell of concrete dust. Outside, German artillery continued to fall sporadically, the shells creating brief flashes of light in the darkness. The captain spread a map on the table, marking the positions where German attacks had been heaviest, identifying the sectors that would likely face the strongest pressure in the morning. Lieutenant Brykalski, Raginis's second-in-command, leaned forward to study the map. He was a young officer, barely out of military school, but the day's fighting had aged him considerably. His uniform was torn and stained with dirt, his face streaked with sweat and grime. Yet his eyes remained steady as he listened to his captain's assessment of their situation. The discussion that followed would later become the stuff of legend. Raginis spoke quietly but firmly about their mission, their duty, and the oath they had all sworn when they became soldiers. He reminded them that they were not just fighting for a piece of ground, but for the very soul of Poland. Every German soldier they killed or wounded here was one less to threaten Warsaw. Every hour they held was another chance for their countrymen to prepare new defenses. Then, in a moment that would echo through history, Captain Raginis and Lieutenant Brikalski made their sacred vow. Standing in that concrete bunker, surrounded by the tools of war and the sound of distant artillery, they swore before their fellow officers that they would not leave their post alive. They would fight until the end, and if defeat came, they would choose death over surrender. It was not bravado or theatrics. It was a solemn promise, witnessed by men who understood its full implications. The second day brought renewed German fury. Guderian, frustrated by his inability to quickly overwhelm what should have been a minor obstacle, committed more troops and artillery to the assault. The bombardment that morning was heavier than anything the Poles had yet experienced. Shells of every caliber rained down on the defensive positions, turning the landscape into a moonscape of craters and rubble. Several bunkers took direct hits, their concrete walls cracking under the tremendous force. Yet when the barrage lifted and German infantry advanced once again, they found the Polish positions still very much alive. Machine guns chattered from undamaged embrasures, rifles cracked from hidden positions, and mortars dropped shells among the advancing formations. The defense was weakening, certainly, but it was far from broken. The fighting intensified as German tanks finally found ways through the marshy approaches, their steel hulks grinding forward through the mud, while infantry sheltered behind them. Polish anti-tank rifles cracked from concealed positions, their precious 20 rounds expended with surgical precision. Each shot had to count, each bullet a small prayer against the mechanical tide rolling toward them. The defenders watched as their shots sparked off German armor, some penetrating, others deflecting harmlessly into the sky. Captain Raginis moved through the trenches connecting his bunkers, his uniform now as battered and stained as those of his men. A piece of shrapnel had opened a gash across his forehead, blood trickling down his face, but his voice remained steady as he called out orders and encouragement. He paused at each position, checking ammunition levels, redistributing supplies from damaged bunkers to those still fighting. His presence seemed to materialize wherever the fighting was heaviest, wherever his men needed their captain most. The German assault tactics evolved throughout the day. Guderian's engineers had studied the Polish positions during the night, identifying weak points and planning more sophisticated attacks. Smoke shells began falling among the bunkers, creating dense clouds that obscured the defenders' fields of fire. Under cover of this artificial fog, German infantry crept closer, using Bangalore torpedoes and satchel charges to blast gaps in the Polish wire obstacles. Yet every German advance met fierce resistance. Polish soldiers fought from shell holes when their bunkers were destroyed, from trenches when the shell holes became untenable. They fell back from position to position in good order, making the Germans pay for every meter of ground. The retreat was not panic or collapse, but the disciplined withdrawal of professional soldiers who understood that their mission was to inflict maximum casualties while buying maximum time. By midday, the German forces had penetrated the outer defensive ring, but at a cost that shocked even veteran Wehrmacht officers. Bodies in field-grey uniforms carpeted the approaches to the Polish positions. German medics worked frantically to evacuate the wounded, while artillery observers called for increasingly heavy bombardments to suppress the stubborn defenders. The schedule that called for the position to be overrun in hours had stretched into a second full day of costly fighting. The afternoon brought a new horror as German Stuka dive bombers appeared overhead, their distinctive gull wings and screaming sirens adding a new dimension to the battle. The aircraft dove almost vertically toward the Polish positions, releasing their bombs at the last possible moment before pulling up in steep climbs. The earth shook with each explosion, concrete fragments flying like deadly rain. Several bunkers suffered direct hits, their roofs caving in and burying the defenders beneath tons of rubble. Through it all, Captain Raginis continued to command. His radio crackled with reports from his scattered positions, each message painting a grimmer picture than the last. Bunker after bunker fell silent, their crews dead or too badly wounded to continue fighting. Ammunition ran dangerously low as the day wore on, forcing the defenders to make every shot count. Machine gun bursts became shorter, more carefully aimed. Artillery fire was reserved for only the most critical moments. As evening approached on September 9th, the Polish position had been reduced to a handful of strongpoints clustered around the central command bunker. German forces had infiltrated between the remaining positions, cutting communication lines and isolating the defenders. Yet from each surviving bunker, Polish guns continued to fire, their muzzle flashes winking defiantly in the gathering darkness. That night, as German artillery continued its relentless pounding, Captain Raginis conducted what he knew would be his final inspection of the positions. Moving through communication trenches now half filled with rubble, he reached each remaining bunker to speak with his men. Many were wounded, all were exhausted, but none spoke of surrender. They had made their choice days ago, following their captain's example and their own sense of duty. The conversations in those bunkers were quiet, almost intimate, despite the thunder of artillery outside. Veterans spoke of their families back home, young soldiers of sweethearts they might never see again. Officers checked their sidearms and made final entries in unit diaries that would probably never be found. Medics distributed the last of their morphine to the most seriously wounded, knowing there would be no resupply. Captain Raginis returned to his command bunker as dawn approached on September 10th. The structure had taken several near misses during the night, its walls cracked and portions of the ceiling sagging dangerously. His radio operator, a young sergeant who had remained at his post throughout the three-day battle, looked up as the captain entered. The man's face was grey with exhaustion and concrete dust, his hands steady on the radio controls despite the tremor of shell shock. The reports coming through the radio painted the final picture. Of the original defensive line, only 2 bunkers remained in action. Both were located in the center of the position on Strenkowa Gora, within sight of the command post. Their machine guns had been reduced to single weapons, their crews decimated by 3 days of continuous fighting. Most critically, ammunition was nearly exhausted. The end was approaching with mathematical certainty. German artillery preparation began before sunrise, a bombardment more intense than anything that had come before. The remaining Polish positions disappeared in clouds of smoke and flying debris, as shells of every caliber concentrated on the tiny area still holding out. The command bunker shook violently with each near miss, chunks of concrete falling from the ceiling to crash on the floor below. When the barrage finally lifted, German infantry surged forward for what everyone knew would be the final assault. They advanced cautiously, expecting the fierce resistance that had characterized every previous attack. Instead, they found an eerie silence from most of the Polish positions. Bunker after bunker had been reduced to rubble, their defenders buried beneath the wreckage of their concrete fortresses. Yet from the command bunker and one remaining strongpoint, Polish weapons still fired. Machine gun tracers lanced out toward the advancing Germans, forcing them to take cover and call for tank support. The defense was down to perhaps 30 men, but they continued to fight with the same determination they had shown on the first day. It was then that General Guderian himself appeared on the battlefield. The German commander had grown increasingly frustrated with the delay imposed by this insignificant Polish force. His corps was needed elsewhere, other objectives waited, and the schedule demanded that Wizna be cleared immediately. Standing within sight of the remaining Polish positions, he made a decision that would test the very foundations of military honor. Through a megaphone, Guderian's voice carried across the battlefield to the Polish defenders. His message was simple and devastating. Unless the remaining bunkers surrendered immediately, all Polish prisoners taken during the 3-day battle would be executed. It was a threat that violated every convention of warfare, but it was delivered by a man who had grown tired of Polish resistance and was determined to end it by any means necessary. The threat reached Captain Raginis in his command bunker, transmitted by German soldiers who had approached under a white flag. The captain listened to the ultimatum in silence, his face betraying no emotion as he considered his options. Around him, his surviving officers waited for his decision. They all understood what was at stake, not just for themselves but for their captured comrades. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the battlefield fell silent. German soldiers waited in their positions, watching the Polish bunkers. In those concrete chambers, Polish soldiers gripped their weapons and waited for their captain's word. The weight of command had never been heavier, the burden of decision never more terrible. Captain Raginis looked around at his remaining men, these soldiers who had followed him through 3 days of hell and were prepared to follow him into whatever came next. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet but clear enough for every man to hear. The words he chose would define not just the end of the battle, but the meaning of everything they had endured. Captain Raginis stood and faced his men one final time. He thanked them for their courage, for their sacrifice, for proving that some oaths are sacred beyond life itself. Then he gave his last order. His soldiers would surrender and live, but he would keep his vow. As his men filed out of the bunker, Raginis pulled the pin from a grenade and held it to his chest. The explosion that followed marked not just the end of one man's life, but the birth of a legend that would inspire generations. Today, nearly 80 years later, we remember Captain Raginis not because he won a battle, but because he showed us what it means to keep faith when everything else falls away.